I only like free speech when people agree with me. Today on Contemporary Issue Wednesday. Alright guys, so today I want to talk a little bit about freedom of speech, the bedrock of Western democratic society. What is it? Why is it so important? And have we seen attempts at silencing free speech in our society? So let's get into it. Look, simply put, the freedom of speech, the right to self-expression, to express your political views, religious views, artistic views, views about cat videos, is one of the fundamental rights, is probably the foundational right on Western civilization. Now, if you think about it, freedom of speech actually hasn't been around that long in human history. I mean, for most of human history, if you spoke out against the king, the emperor, the military dictatorship, you were going to be killed. You were going to be put in prison. You're going to be tortured. You'd be denounced. If you spoke out against the church or the religious authority of the day and it didn't match up to what they said was gospel truth, you were going to be put in jail. You were going to be persecuted. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon that over the last 200, 300 years, Western society has enjoyed freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech is important for so many reasons. I'm not going to get into much of a discussion there. I will say that it is a foundational bedrock of a well-functioning democracy. If people can talk about different issues, if they're not fearful, if you can exchange, the free exchange of ideas is so important because, as J.S. Mill described, this free exchange of ideas actually helps society get to more of an understanding of the truth, of what is right or wrong in a policy context. And so if you have this free exchange of ideas, new and creative ideas can come forth. People aren't afraid to challenge the status quo, and so there can be progress, or there can be a cementing of what actually works. And so this constant ability to express yourself, and it's not only in the political realm, it's in the artistic realm. I mean, one of the reasons why Western society is so successful in producing artistic cultures is because they cultivate a free area of expression where people can push the envelope artistically. It's the same in businesses. Businesses in the United States and in the Western world in general are very entrepreneurial, very creative, because they have the freedom to experiment, to challenge, to do these types of things. Now, freedom of speech is very important, but there are limits to our ability to freely express ourselves. One of these things is, does our speech actually cause physical harm? That's why you can't run into a really crowded public place and yell fire and have a stampede erupt. You're going to get charged for that. You can't defame people. You can't go on record saying something that you know isn't true in order to defame someone. That is illegal. News organizations or institutions can't get up tomorrow and say, hey, look, let's share to the world how you can create a homemade bomb and the best way to circumvent the authorities and where to place this bomb. Obviously, because all of these different expressions of speech cause harm. And so there are areas, and for different societies and different countries, these boundaries might be a little bit different, might extend or recede depending on where you are. And so that's freedom of speech, why it's so important in some of the boundaries. What I have seen over the last maybe 10 or 15 years is a little bit of an erosion of the freedom of speech, at least in America, and I think this can extend to many societies, both Western and non-Western. Now, I just want to go over two examples of the sort of curtailing or the pressure of silencing free speech, and it'll come from both sides of the political spectrum, from the right, the conservatives, and the liberal, the left. So let's start with the right, the conservatives. In recent years, the most powerful example of the right seeking to curtail free speech was during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The Bush administration was invading Iraq. I remember a lot of pressure being put on journalists, artists, individual people who were speaking out against the war in Iraq as if they were being unpatriotic. And this is usually the way that people on the right try to seek to curtail freedom of speech, if it's not patriotic enough. And so you heard during the campaign, Donald Trump had mentioned that he would like to arrest or imprison people who burn the American flag. A right, incidentally, that is protected under the United States Constitution as freedom of expression. I agree with that. Do I agree with burning the flag? Do I think burning the flag is great? No. Do I think that people should be put in prison? No. It's totally their right to do that. So usually when freedom of speech is curtailed on the right, it has been due to a sort of patriotic, we have to carry the patriotic tide, pride of the nation. So that's a more conservative right-wing example of curtailing free speech. On the left, there's a lot of examples that come under the heading political correctness. And now this issue of political correctness and what political correctness does, I'll get into in other episodes. But basically, political correctness starts from the premise that, we want to create an inclusive, non-offensive society. Now, those things might be good intentions, but in reality, what that does is it creates barriers into the type of language you can use. And importantly, those barriers can be ever extensive. And so the argument runs, anyone who speaks politically incorrectly or speaks with a more harsh or non-inclusive language is automatically labeled either a racist or a xenophobe or an Islamophobe, homophobe. You can fill in the phobe wherever you want. A good example of this happens on college universities, which is really ironic because college universities were supposed to be, if anywhere, the bastion of freedom of speech, of freedom of expression. So even just a few days ago at UC Berkeley, which was the pinnacle of sort of freedom of expression movement in the 1960s and the 1970s, a speaker who was very conservative went to UC Berkeley to give a speech. This is totally within his constitutional rights to go to UC Berkeley and make this speech. It's people's right to protest, but not necessarily to ban him from speaking. That would be unconstitutional. And so what happens? This speaker goes to UC Berkeley and protests break out, and they're so severe and they're so damaging and they're so violent that UC Berkeley University actually has to cancel the lecture because property is being destroyed, people are cussing each other out, people are being pepper sprayed by protesters, these types of things. And you sit back and you wonder and say, okay, the protesters obviously don't agree with this person's ideological viewpoint. But the question is, if you disagree with someone, does that give you the right to silence them if their speech isn't causing physical harm? And the answer, the Constitution would say, is absolutely not. They have a right to speak, to have freedom of speech. And so the problem with the left, and this is what many people, particularly many Donald Trump supporters, saw with the problem of the left is they say that they're tolerant, they say that they want diversity, but the argument against them is, well, you actually don't want diversity of ideology. You don't want diversity of opinion. You want everyone to agree with you. And so if a speaker comes to your campus, UC Berkeley, which is a notorious left-wing campus, if a speaker comes to your campus who is very right-wing, and you don't even allow him to speak on your campus because you're so upset with his ideas, well, that's obviously not a very tolerant, that's obviously not a very inclusive ideology. You are actually just as intolerant as the people you claim are being intolerant because you won't even let them exercise their constitutional right of freedom of speech. So, to sum up, on the left, usually freedom of speech gets curtailed because of political correctness. On the right, freedom of speech is usually curtailed for patriotic reasons because you're not being patriotic enough, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is really worrying because, again, I think that almost every opinion, as long as it doesn't cause physical harm, needs to be protected. And if you stifle speech, if you stifle free expression, ultimately what you're doing is you're harming your state because you're keeping people quiet. You could potentially cut off any progress because people would become afraid to actually debate these types of point of view. And probably most importantly, you're creating polarization because as people are fearful of speaking out because their rights or they'll be condemned as being someone who is anti-patriotic or anti-American, people are just going to huddle in their little groups and become polarized. And so to me, the worst part about curtailing freedom of speech is it actually cements people in their little ideological groups because they don't trust that other people will honor them and give them the space to express themselves. They'll be labeled a racist, or they'll be labeled a communist, or they'll be labeled homophobic, or they'll be labeled anti-American. And so people just huddle into their groups and there's no dialogue that actually takes place. So, ladies and gentlemen, what can we take away as realists? All I want to say is we must protect people's right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression, particularly and specifically when we disagree with them the most. That is when you have to protect their rights. Because if we as a society just think that the majority can deem what is right or wrong in freedom of speech, that might work for you today because your views might be in the majority today, but what happens in 10 years' time when your views, your opinions are in the minority and the majority decides that that kind of freedom of speech or expression is illegitimate? No one's going to be there to protect you. And that's why freedom of speech is so valuable. Alright guys, share the video, subscribe to the channel, comment below what do you think about the status of freedom of speech in our societies today, and remember, reality always trumps ideology.